They called it a jihadist blockade. But the real blockade was information. For weeks, French media thundered across the airwaves, Jeune Afrique, RFI, TV5 Monde, declaring that Mali was falling. That Bamako was surrounded, that the people were desperate. But step into Bamako's streets, and you hear something else: laughter, music, and the hum of construction. This is not a war of guns, it's a war of stories. And Mali, once again, stands in the crossfire of empire and truth. When France lost its bases, it built new trenches, in headlines and hashtags. When soldiers withdrew, words advanced. And when silence became resistance, Bamako fought back, not with bullets, but with evidence, with calm, with dignity. If you believe truth itself is under siege, stay till the end, because what you're about to see is not a news report. It's a battlefield. On November 9, 2025, the African Union released a statement, urgent international action, for Mali. The AU claimed that terrorist groups had blockaded Bamako, cut fuel, and isolated millions. French media echoed the alarm, amplifying panic across the continent. But in Mali itself, the government was calm. President Assimi Goita inaugurated 15 new hospitals that very same week. Markets stayed open, roads remained clear, and life went on. So what exactly was collapsing, Mali's security, or France's narrative? And if this crisis never existed, then who created it, and why? For decades, Africa's enemies have not only fought for its gold, its uranium, or its oil. They have fought for its image. And in this new century, propaganda has become the most profitable weapon. When French troops left Mali, they didn't surrender the battlefield, they just changed its coordinates. No longer in the Sahel's dust, but in the digital clouds of Western media. From Paris to Brussels, from London to Dakar, headlines began to scream, Bamako under siege. Fuel crisis in Mali. Hospitals without electricity. Yet not one of these reporters had set foot on Malian soil. Jeune Afrique, once a magazine of ideas, had become the megaphone of a fading empire. TV5 Monde and RFI replayed the same story, over and over, as if repetition could make fiction become fact. They spoke of terrorist blockades, of imminent takeover, of cities cut from the world. And somewhere in Dakar, an analyst named Beverly Owing appeared on screen, a woman who called herself a Sahel expert. A Wagner watcher. She said she knew everything about Mali's internal chaos. But she lived hundreds of kilometers away, in another country. So how did she know so much? Dig a little deeper. And her trail leads not to Bamako, but to an organization linked with the CIA, one that supplies narratives to major Western outlets, BBC Africa, Al Jazeera English, and others. It's a system, a chain of command for storytelling. One writes the script, another translates, a third broadcasts, and by the time it reaches African ears, it sounds like truth. The lie about Bamako's blockade was only the opening salvo. It was designed to create panic, to make Malians doubt their government, to make investors flee, and to paint Goita as a reckless soldier playing nation builder. But in Bamako, life went on. Children walked to school, vendors shouted prices, and builders laid brick after brick for new hospitals. The supposed siege existed only on a screen. Behind the camera, another war was being waged, the war of perception. France, having lost control of Sahel's resources, sought to control the story instead. Its communicators, frustrated at the collapse of their influence, began funding networks of bots, fake accounts, and anonymous analysts, who would flood X and Facebook with the same alarming tone: the capital is falling. The junta is panicking. Mali is doomed. It was not journalism. It was psychological warfare. Every headline was a drone strike on public confidence. Every rumor, a landmine in the path of sovereignty. When French citizens were told to leave Bamako immediately, it wasn't about safety, it was theater. A diplomatic performance to convince the world that Mali was lost. But who was really in danger? the expatriates? Or the truth? In real time, Malian authorities responded not with outrage, but with composure. Goita's government released footage of daily life, markets thriving, schools open, and soldiers guarding the borders. The Ministry of Communication challenged Jeune Afrique directly, if your sources are real, show them. Silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Africans across the continent began to notice the pattern. The same outlets that once justified NATO's bombing of Libya were now condemning Mali's sovereignty. The same journalists who ignored French soldiers' abuses suddenly cared about humanitarian crises. And people asked, why now? Because the Sahel had become the fault line between two worlds, one that believes Africa must obey, and one that believes Africa must decide. In that tension, France's media offensive found its true purpose, not to report, but to reclaim obedience. But the plan started to fail. The more they lied, the more Malians filmed the truth. Street videos from Bamako contradicted their stories. Independent reporters from neighboring countries entered Mali and saw calm. The narrative began to collapse, and with it, the illusion of France's moral authority. Still, the propaganda didn't stop. RFI aired segments about power cuts lasting a month. TF1 spoke of empty shelves. France Info warned of mass displacement. Yet electricity flowed, markets were full, and Bamako's skyline lit up at night. It was never about facts, it was about fatigue. If you bombard people with enough to spare, they stop asking for proof. They start accepting hopelessness as normal. That was the real goal, to exhaust Africa's hope. But something stronger emerged from Mali's silence, resolve. Ordinary citizens began confronting online lies, tagging reporters, demanding evidence. Digital resistance replaced physical protest. And every calm answer from Bamako felt like a slap to those who expected chaos. As one Malian journalist said, they wanted to make us look like victims. We showed them we were builders. This was the moment the media war turned against its masters. Jeune Afrique's credibility began to crumble. Online audiences shifted toward Pan-African channels, where citizens spoke in their own voices. Truth, slow, quiet, and profitable truth, was winning. If you've seen this kind of manipulation before, tell us in the comments. Because this isn't just about Mali. It's about every nation that has been spoken for instead of listened to. It's about the right to define your own reality. And as the world learns again, words can occupy, but they can also liberate. While Paris shouted chaos, Bamako built hospitals. While Jeune Afrique wrote of despair, Mali wrote blueprints. And while France declared collapse, ordinary people simply went to work. The calm of Mali was not weakness, it was resistance. Because in the war of perception, serenity itself is defiance. President Assimi Goita stood before cameras, not to argue. Not to threaten, but to launch 15 new hospitals across the country. 15. In a week of so-called terrorist blockade. He didn't deliver grand speeches about propaganda. He laid the first brick of a maternity ward. He didn't call for the world's sympathy, he called for doctors and engineers. The message was simple: Mali will build, even under fire. The construction sites became more than infrastructure, they became symbols. Cranes rising where lies had fallen. Concrete as rebuttal. Every nail driven into the foundation said, "You cannot fabricate our reality." Outside, in the markets of Bamako, the rhythm of life continued. Women haggled for mangoes. Children shouted football scores. Electric lights flickered on in the evening. No barricades. No panic. No proof of the apocalypse being broadcast to the world. Yet the foreign press ignored all of it. RFI ran another story about empty fuel stations. France Info insisted electricity blackouts had paralyzed the capital. But travelers arriving in Bamako found taxis waiting, generators humming, and streetlights glowing into the night. One journalist from Ghana, who visited during that week, described what he saw. They told me to prepare for a city under siege. Instead, I found construction dust and schoolchildren in uniform. That single testimony did more to expose the lie than 1,000 diplomatic statements. It revealed how propaganda collapses when confronted by evidence, however small. Malian state television responded not with censorship but with transparency. They broadcast live footage from various cities, Ks. Mopti, Gao, showing calm streets and functioning infrastructure. They even invited international journalists to verify conditions firsthand. Few accepted the invitation. The myth of crisis was too profitable to abandon. And so, Mali chose a different strategy, to fight misinformation with demonstration. To replace every accusation with an act of progress. To let deeds speak louder than press releases. It was subtle, but devastatingly effective. Because every day Bamako stayed calm, every day schools opened, every hospital foundation laid, it disarmed the narrative of collapse. Even those inside France began to notice the hypocrisy. Clips went viral of French farmers dumping manure outside government offices, protesting unbearable taxes, while their media accused Mali of instability. The irony was impossible to ignore. Those who failed to manage their own unrest were lecturing Africa about order. At that moment, a shift began, not in weapons, but in awareness. Africans were realizing that sovereignty was not only political or military, it was informational. To control your story is to control your destiny. And Mali was reclaiming both. Meanwhile, foreign analysts obsessed over Wagner's presence, Russian advisors, Iranian trade talks, anything to imply that Mali's calm was artificial. But Mali's real strength came from something less visible, unity. For the first time in years, civilians, soldiers, and even traditional leaders stood on the same side of truth. They knew the propaganda was not meant to destroy the government. It was meant to divide the people. It failed. Instead, it united them in quiet defiance. A teacher in Sigu told his students, "Let them write about our fall. We'll keep writing our future." That is the essence of African-style resistance, not loud, but enduring. It's the strength of silence that refuses to echo the colonizer's noise. In meetings with the Transitional Council, Goita emphasized discipline in communication. "Do not reply with anger," he said. "Show results. Let the facts speak for Mali." It was a masterstroke. By refusing to play the propaganda game, Mali starved it of oxygen. The Western narrative demanded outrage to feed its headlines, but Bamako gave it tranquility. And nothing disarms a liar faster than peace. In the following weeks, Malian engineers posted images of the new hospital foundations. Doctors filmed videos thanking local workers for their efforts. Ordinary citizens shared footage of weddings, markets, harvest festivals. Hashtags like #MaliBuilds and #TruthFromBamako began trending across West Africa. Suddenly, the algorithm itself, the tool once used against them, turned into an amplifier of African dignity. The silence of the French media grew deafening. They could not admit they were wrong, but they could no longer pretend to be right. Across the Sahel, the message resonated. In Burkina Faso and Niger, state broadcasters cited Mali's example in confronting Western disinformation. Young people began questioning foreign news sources, cross-checking information before sharing it. The audience was waking up. For centuries, colonizers had rewritten Africa's image. Now, Africa was editing the script back. Still, the attacks continued. Each time a small clash occurred in the north, foreign outlets magnified it as proof of instability. But Malians had learned to read between the lines. They knew that exaggeration was a tactic, panic was the goal. And they refused to panic. Slowly, international observers realized that the predicted collapse of Mali never came. The jihadists didn't reach Bamako. The economy didn't implode. Instead, Mali secured its borders. diversified its alliances, and invested in healthcare and education. This quiet progress was not spectacular, it was steady, deliberate, unyielding. And in the long history of Africa's struggles, steadiness has always been more revolutionary than speed. Because revolutions that shout are easy to suppress. But revolutions that build, brick by brick, last forever. If France hoped to destroy Mali's credibility, it achieved the opposite. It revealed how fragile its own narrative had become. The empire that once ruled by sword and sermon now trembles before a nation armed only with truth. And in Bamako's stillness, you can almost hear the echo of defiance. Not in chants, not in marches, but in the sound of construction. Steel bending, cement mixing, hammers striking rhythmically like a national heartbeat. That sound says everything the world needs to know. Mali is not collapsing. Mali is creating. When an empire retreats, it does not disappear, it changes its disguise. France's defeat in Mali was not just military, it was psychological. They lost the land, so they sought to conquer the narrative. For over a century, Paris ruled through stories, tales of civilization, of security, of partnership. And when those tales stopped working, they wrote new ones. The Sahel is unstable without France. Mali cannot govern itself. Goita is a dictator. But behind these words lay a different truth. France was not worried about Mali's instability. It was terrified of Mali's success. Because if Mali stood on its own, others would follow. Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, the entire Sahel might realize they don't need France to survive. And the myth of dependency, carefully built over generations, would collapse overnight. So, while French troops packed their bags, French media loaded their weapons. Jeune Afrique became a war room. TV5 Monde became an echo chamber. RFI, France Info, and TF1 turned headlines into artillery shells. Their mission, to convince Africans that independence was chaos, and foreign control was peace. It was not the first time. From the Congo crisis of the 1960s to the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, the same pattern repeated: destabilize, delegitimize, and dominate the narrative. When guns failed, cameras replaced them. But Mali refused to play the victim. Instead of issuing denials, the government showed results. Instead of responding to every accusation, they built alliances, not just with Russia or China, but with the people. Pan-African unity became the new front line. Goita, Traoré, and Kiani, three men from three nations, stood together not just as leaders, but as symbols. They weren't uniting armies. They were uniting perception. Their photos went viral, young, determined, unapologetic. The West called them military juntas. Africa called them sons of sovereignty. The more Western media mocked, the more Africans listened. Because people are not blind to tone, they can hear contempt when it's spoken in the name of democracy. And nothing exposes hypocrisy faster than arrogance. Meanwhile, in Benin, a small coastal state once outside the headlines, satellite images showed something strange. Foreign troops assembling, amphibious landings rehearsed. French officers strategizing with local forces. Officially, these were joint exercises. Unofficially, it was a waiting zone, a staging ground for future redeployment into the Sahel. It proved what Bamako had warned all along. The empire was not gone. It was regrouping. But this time, Africa was watching. Pan-African media exposed the troop movements. Analysts from Nigeria, Ghana, and even Europe began questioning France's motives. A simple question echoed across the continent. If France truly left, why are its soldiers still so close? The answer was uncomfortable. Control has never required occupation, only access. Access to perception, to data, to minds. France no longer needed to plant a flag, it only needed to shape belief. This is how neocolonialism looks in the age of algorithms. Not through chains, but through headlines. Not through armies, but through narratives. Every false story about Mali's collapse served a larger purpose: to isolate the country from sympathy. To make Africans doubt their own brothers. It was soft warfare, invisible, persistent, and global. But soft power cuts both ways. The same social media used for manipulation became the weapon of exposure. Independent creators, bloggers, and journalists began tracing how every source led back to the same small circle of Western agencies. And the illusion began to crack. As one Burkinabe writer posted, "They call us unstable because we no longer obey. They call us dangerous because we no longer fear." Across the Sahel, that defiance spread like wildfire. Nigerians, Ghanaians, Senegalese, everyone saw their reflection in Mali's struggle. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about dignity. And when dignity becomes contagious, empire becomes irrelevant. France's frustration grew visible. Officials accused Mali of spreading Russian propaganda. But the irony was painful. The same journalists who fabricated stories of jihadist blockades now complained about disinformation. The fox, accusing the henhouse of deceit. Back in Bamako, Goita stayed silent. No press conferences, no Twitter threads. Only results. Roads opened, hospitals rose, power grids expanded. While Paris debated Mali's chaos, Bamako extended electricity to villages that had waited decades. Each project became a statement. We do not need their permission to progress. Even Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, echoed this sentiment: there will be no foreign boots in Mali. It was not just a promise, it was a line in the sand. Still, France could not let go. Its economy, strained by sanctions and domestic unrest, was bleeding influence abroad. Losing Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso meant losing access to uranium, gold, and the psychological comfort of dominance. And so, Paris resorted to its oldest tactic: fear. Fear sells faster than facts. Fear unites the indifferent. Fear keeps the colonial wound bleeding. The Western narrative told Africans, "Without us, you'll fall." But Africa replied, "Without us, you would never have stood." This is not rhetoric, it is history. From the exploitation of Niger's uranium to the theft of Mali's gold. France built prosperity on African resources while preaching equality. Now, as those resources slip away, they preach instability. Yet the truth is clear. Mali's sovereignty is not the source of chaos, it's the end of it. Because sovereignty means making your own mistakes, and your own miracles. It means being free enough to fail, to rebuild, to rise again, without permission. That is what France fears most, not a failed state, but a successful one. Because a successful Mali proves that liberation works. And if liberation works in one place, it can work everywhere. As the video feeds loop on TV5 and RFI. As analysts debate the crisis in Mali, a quiet revolution unfolds in real time, not in parliaments or palaces, but in the hearts of ordinary Africans. They no longer ask, "Who will save us?" They ask, "Why did we ever believe we needed saving?" If you believe Africa deserves the right to tell its own story, hit like. Because every click, every comment, every share weakens the walls of the false narrative. And one day, when those walls crumble completely, the world will finally see what Bamako has known all along. That the loudest voice is not always the truest one. And that the calm of a free people, however silent, is louder than the propaganda of an empire. And just when Mali thought it had unmasked every enemy, another voice joined the chorus, one that spoke with an African accent but carried a foreign echo. On November 9, the African Union released a statement, urgent, emotional, dramatic, calling for international action in Mali. At first, it sounded noble, concerned, patriotic. But then came the fine print. The AU claimed that terrorist groups had imposed blockades, and that the humanitarian situation was worsening. Sound familiar? It was the same script, word for word, first aired by RFI and Jeune Afrique. Only now, it wore African clothes. This was the twist Mali never expected, the continent's own institution repeating the empire's lines. The voice of unity turned into an amplifier of dependency. And why wouldn't it? 60% of the African Union's budget comes from the European Union. 60%, not for partnerships, but for influence. When the hand that funds you trembles, your voice follows its rhythm. So when the AU called for international intervention, what it really did was expose how deep the colonial roots still run. It wasn't Mali that was in crisis. It was Africa's conscience. How could an African organization call for foreign troops to act against an African government elected by its people? How could the guardians of independence forget who they were guarding? Mali's answer was quiet but sharp. We are not at war with ourselves. We are at war with lies. For the first time, millions of Africans saw the AU not as a symbol of unity, but as a mirror, reflecting everything Africa still needed to free itself from. And in Bamako, that realization hardened into resolve. If the institutions of Africa could be bought, then the will of Africa must remain priceless. France's greatest victory was never the colonies, it was convincing Africans to police themselves on its behalf. That illusion is dying. Because every generation of Africans is now more connected, more informed, and less afraid. From Dakar to Nairobi, young voices began to rise. We don't need international action. We need African action. We don't need saviors. We need sovereignty. And for the first time, the propaganda war revealed its final irony. The empire's power no longer comes from Europe, it comes from African institutions afraid to disappoint Europe. But even that is changing. Because Mali has shown a simple truth. When you stop asking for permission, you stop being a colony. The AU statement will fade, like all press releases do. But what remains, the memory of betrayal, will fuel something larger. It will remind Africa that freedom is not only seized from outsiders, but reclaimed from within. Truth has no army. But it has those who refuse to kneel. From Bamako to Niamey, from Ouagadougou to Conakry, Africa's new revolution does not march with guns, it builds with truth. The empire has lost its grip, not because it was defeated, but because Africans stopped believing in it. Mali's calm has become the continent's compass. Its dignity, the continent's defense. Its silence, the continent's storm. If this story reached your heart, don't let it fade. Like, comment, and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for Africa's voice. Because every word you share is one less weapon of their lies. And every act of awareness is a brick in Africa's foundation of truth. We are no longer the story they tell. We are the storytellers. And the world is finally listening.